There's a version of Betty Broderick that most people know, the version with the wild eyes and the answering machine messages, the version who rammed a car through a front door and spray-painted the walls of a home that used to belong to her, the version who walked into a bedroom in the early hours of November morning in 1989 and fired a gun at two sleeping people, killing her ex-husband Daniel T. Broderick III and his new wife, Linda Colquina Broderick. That is the version the world was given. That is a version that sold television movies and filled courtroom galleries and made Betty Broderick a name that people still recognize decades later. But before she died on May 8, 2026, at the age of 78, inside the California Institution for Women, Betty Broderick left behind something the world hadn't fully reckoned with, her own words, in writing, telling a story that looks very different from the one most people have accepted as the truth. She was not born into chaos. She was not, by any early measure, a woman destined to end up where she ended up. Elizabeth and Bisheglia came into the world on November 7, 1947, in New York, raised in a large Catholic family, schooled in discipline and tradition, and a belief that hard work and loyalty were the currencies that mattered most. She was bright. She was driven. She earned a scholarship to Mount St. Vincent College, and it was there, in the idealistic late years of the 1960s, that she met the man who would define the rest of her life in ways neither of them could have imagined, Daniel T. Broderick III was the kind of young man people remembered, charming, focused, burning with ambition, in the specific way of someone who already knows exactly what he wants and is simply waiting for the world to deliver it. He wanted to be a doctor and a lawyer. He told people this, and they believed him, because everything about him suggested he was capable of becoming exactly that. Betty believed him, too. More than believed, she committed. She worked multiple jobs while Daniel attended Cornell Medical School. She worked again while he attended Harvard Law School. She bore their children, managed the movement of the family from one city to another as his career required, built the social infrastructure of a successful couple, maintained the household, cultivated the relationships that a man building a professional reputation needed his wife to cultivate. She was not a passive figure in the life of Daniel Broderick. She was, in many ways, its architect, and for a time, the life she helped build looked, from the outside, like everything anyone could want. By the early years of the 1980s, the Brodericks had settled in La Jolla, California. Daniel was one of the most successful medical malpractice attorneys in San Diego. There were 4 children, a large house, memberships at country clubs, vacations to destinations that required a passport. The life was real. What was also real, though invisible to most of the people who saw it, was what Betty would later spend decades trying to describe: the sensation of becoming a ghost in the life you built, of watching a man absorb credit and recognition and professional glory for an existence that required your complete sacrifice to construct, while your role in that construction was quietly rendered invisible. She described feeling not like a partner, but like a set piece, present, functional, expected, and unseen. In 1983, Daniel Broderick hired a young woman named Linda Colquina to work as his assistant. Betty noticed. Betty said so. Betty raised it with him, repeatedly, across years, and Daniel dismissed her repeatedly across years. Whether or not Daniel and Linda were romantically involved during the years, he denied it remains a question that was never cleanly resolved to Betty's satisfaction. What is documented is that in 1985, Daniel Broderick filed for divorce, and what followed was not the kind of legal dissolution that ends in 2 people walking away and rebuilding. What followed was, by Betty's account, the most prolonged and deliberate act of destruction one person had ever carried out against her. The word that keeps appearing in Betty Broderick's own descriptions of this period is weapon. She described the legal system as a weapon. She described Daniel's professional knowledge as a weapon. She described the imbalance between them, him, a high-powered attorney with deep connections in the San Diego legal community, and her, a woman with no legal training, increasingly limited financial resources, and a mounting sense that no one in the process was actually looking out for her, as a weapon he had constructed and was using with precision. A local real estate broker who reviewed the public record of the Broderick divorce proceedings and reportedly maintained correspondence with Betty in the years between 2022 and 2023 later, noted that the case had been consistently underread as a story about infidelity, when the financial architecture, what happened, who controlled the assets, how they were divided, who had leverage and who did not, was at least as central to the conflict as any emotional betrayal. In other words, Betty was not simply a woman scorned. She was a woman who believed she was being systematically stripped of everything she had helped to build by a man who knew exactly which legal mechanisms to deploy to make that stripping possible and to make it look, from the outside, like nothing more than the ordinary machinery of divorce. She was denied what she described as adequate financial support. She was shut out of decisions about her own children. She experienced the custody proceedings not as a dispute between two parents with equal standing, but as a war being waged by someone with vastly superior firepower. And across this period, her behavior did deteriorate. She rammed her car into Daniel's front door. She left messages on his answering machine that were profane and furious, and, in retrospect, the kind of recordings that could be played in a courtroom to devastating effect. She vandalized his property. She was held in contempt of court multiple times. These things happened. She never denied them. What she consistently argued was that they had to be understood as the actions of a person who had exhausted every legitimate option available to her and found them all either blocked or useless. Every time she broke a rule, she said, it was because following the rules had produced nothing except more loss. This argument did not protect her. In the public consciousness and in the legal proceedings that eventually consumed her life, what people remembered was a behavior. The context was treated as an excuse. Betty always insisted it was an explanation. In April of 1989, Daniel married Linda Kolkina. Betty learned about the wedding the same day it took place. 6 months later, she drove to their home before dawn, entered through a door she opened with keys she still possessed, walked to their bedroom, and fired a gun. Daniel died. Linda died. Linda was 28 years old, and the world, watching all this unfold, made a decision about who Betty Broderick was and why she had done what she did, and largely stuck with that decision for the next 3.5 decades. She was tried twice. The first trial, in 1990, ended in a hung jury, a split that revealed exactly how divided people were, not just about Betty's guilt, which was never really in question, but about what her guilt meant and what had produced it. 5 jurors voted for first-degree murder. 1 voted for involuntary manslaughter. The rest landed in the complicated middle. The second trial, in 1991, produced a conviction on 2 counts of second-degree murder and a sentence of 32 years to life. She became eligible for parole. She was denied. She went back. She was denied again. She went back. The cycle continued for more than a decade, and what it revealed, to those who watched it closely, was that the obstacle wasn't danger. Betty Broderick was an elderly woman with no history of violence outside of that single morning in 1989. She was not a threat to anyone in any actuarial sense. The obstacle was something more specific and more stubborn. She could not give a parole board what it wanted, which was a clean, uncomplicated acknowledgement of wrongdoing stripped of everything that had preceded it. She could acknowledge that she had pulled the trigger. She could not stand before a panel of strangers and tell them the story of her life the way they wanted it told, as the story of a violent woman who had committed an inexcusable act, because that telling in her mind was a lie. It left out 30 years of what she believed had been done to her. And Betty Broderick would not tell that lie, not even to walk free. In her letter to the producers of the documentary series Murder Made Me Famous, which represents the most organized and deliberate public statement she ever made, and one of the last pieces of writing she left before she became too ill to speak, Betty used language that she had clearly chosen with care. She described Daniel Broderick as the source of what she called emotional terrorism. She described a sustained pattern of behavior within the marriage, predating the divorce, predating Linda, predating the years of public eruptions, that she framed in terms that have since become central to conversations about domestic abuse. Coercive control. Coercive control is not a single act. It is a pattern. It is a slow, deliberate dismantling of a person's autonomy, sense of self, financial independence, and access to help, carried out through isolation, manipulation, the strategic use of systems, legal, social, financial, and the constant grinding exertion of dominance. It does not require physical violence. It can exist behind a completely normal-looking life. And Betty's argument, made consistently across decades and stated with particular clarity in that final letter, was that it had been present in her marriage long, before anyone outside had any reason to suspect that anything was wrong. She wrote that she had no one to speak for her. Those 7 words contained something that she had been trying to say since the very beginning of all of it. Not just about the morning of the killings, not just about the divorce, but about the entire experience of being a woman in that specific situation at that specific moment in American legal and social history, when the concept of coercive control did not yet have the cultural or legal recognition it has since begun to receive, when the idea that a wealthy, professionally successful man could be the agent of sustained abuse against his own wife inside a picture-perfect marriage was not a story many institutions were equipped to process. She wasn't asking for people to excuse what she had done. She was asking them to understand it, to sit with the entirety of what had happened rather than editing it down to the most lurid and manageable version. The domestic violence advocacy community has, in the years since Betty's case first entered public consciousness, increasingly pointed to it as an early and under-examined example of what coercive control looks like when it is allowed to run its full course without any effective intervention, not as a justification, as a case study, as an argument for why recognizing these patterns early and building legal and social systems capable of responding to them might change outcomes before they reach the point of irreversible catastrophe. Betty's case was a catastrophe. The people who study coercive control point to it and say, this is what we're trying to prevent. None of that brings Daniel Broderick back. None of it brings Linda Colkina Broderick back. Linda, who was 28 years old and whose role in Betty's suffering was far more limited than the fury directed at her would suggest, died in her bed on an early November, mourning and never had the chance to grow old or tell her own story or become whatever she might have become. Daniel's children, Kim, Lee Daniel, and Rhett, grew up without a father, and whatever complicated relationship they maintained with a mother, who was also their father's killer, is a grief and a tangle that belongs to them and not to any outside narrative. Betty knew all of this. She said as much. What she never stopped arguing was that knowing it was not the same as understanding it, and that understanding it required sitting with everything that came before the gun, not just the moment the gun was fired. She died on May 8th, 2026, having never been granted parole, having never been formally recognized by any court or any legal proceeding as a survivor of the pattern she spent her life describing, having never had the account she gave of her own experience acknowledged by the system that imprisoned her. Her son Daniel confirmed the details of her death. She had been on life support in her final days and was unable to speak. The written statements she had left behind, including that letter to the documentary filmmakers, were among the last coherent expressions of what she believed had happened to her and why. She did not ask to be forgiven. She did not retract her account of Daniel Broderick or soften it in the face of death. She described him one final time as a man who had used every tool available to him to diminish and control and ultimately destroy her, and she described herself as a woman who had never been given a fair accounting by history or by the law. Whether that accounting will ever come is an open question, but she made sure, before she ran out of time, that anyone who wanted to hear her version of the story had the chance to hear it. She spoke, she wrote, she insisted, and she died still insisting that the world had been given only half the truth about what happened in that house and about the man who had lived in it with her.